The maintenance shaft swallowed him whole. Ilias dropped into the dark, the hatch clanging shut above him as the pressure differential hit his ears like a fist. Somewhere ahead in the branching dark, armed men were already moving. And somewhere in that same dark, a 6-year-old girl who thought engineers were the most interesting people in the galaxy. He didn't let himself think about what happened if he was wrong about the route. 3 weeks earlier, his jacket had been losing the same argument with his shoulders. The rented formal wear had never fit right, too broad at the collar, too short in the sleeve, and Elias had spent the first hour of the Ethelgard Prime diplomatic summit trying to become invisible inside it. He'd positioned himself near a secondary console at the far edge of the throne room, resonance pad in hand, pulling up hydrothermal network schematics because watching pressure differential cycle was, genuinely, way more interesting than watching ambassadors perform cordiality at each other. He'd almost succeeded at invisible. Then a small hand had latched onto his sleeve. Princess Elara was 6 years old, had apparently slipped her ceremonial escort, and was looking up at him with the focused, unblinking attention of someone who had decided he was worth investigating. She asked him what he was looking at. He told her, honestly, and that he was watching water temperature data from a pipe network under the palace. She asked if that was exciting. He told her, also honestly, that last month at Orbital Station Kestrel 7, a faulty recalibration had flash frozen the entire executive lounge mid-ceremony, while simultaneously overheating the waste processing sector. The resulting pressure event had launched a commemorative fountain sculpture 17 meters into a cargo bay. Nobody was hurt. 3 dignitaries had arrived at a treaty signing covered in what the incident report diplomatically termed mineral residue. Elara had laughed so hard she'd sat down on the floor. He'd sat beside her, jacket bunching awkwardly at his shoulders, and spent the next 40 minutes explaining the magnificent, unglamorous ways that critical systems could fail. She had listened like he was reading scripture. He hadn't thought about it again. He'd filed his exit clearance, packed his kit, and had moved on to the next contract. That was the job. That was always the job, which is why when he'd looked up from the same resonance pad 3 weeks later, same summit, same ill-fitting jacket, same corner, and found a small figure sprinting across the polished throne room floor directly toward him, with the aerodynamic commitment of a person who had made a decision and was no longer accepting input, he hadn't immediately understood what was happening. Elara hit his legs like a comet hitting a station hull. The crowd parted around the collision. Conversations died. 3 ambassadors turned, and Elias stood there, one hand instinctively steadying her small shoulders, resonance pad forgotten, wearing an expression that probably read as a man trying to calculate whether he had violated 17 different protocols simultaneously. He had, as it turned out. Within the hour, he was standing in a private chamber off the East Corridor, a jacket still crooked, while Empress Kalia studied him from across a table with the kind of measured, patient attention that made him feel like a thermal anomaly she hadn't yet classified. She asked how he knew her daughter. He told her about the fountain sculpture. She did not laugh, but something behind her eyes shifted, just slightly, the way a pressure reading shifts when a valve that's been sealed too long finally begins to open. She asked him questions with precise, architectural focus, his qualifications, his security clearance, his familiarity with palace infrastructure. He answered all of them. She nodded at each answer like she was logging data, not making conversation. Then she told him he wouldn't be leaving. Not a threat, a statement of arrangement. The palace required a resident hydrothermal engineer. He was qualified. He would be compensated. He would remain on the grounds under observation while she assessed his influence on the princess. We'd at least look down at the jacket that didn't fit him. He thought about the next contract, the empty bunk on whatever orbital transfer he'd have booked by Thursday, the particular silence of recycled air in a station quarter he'd leave in 2 weeks without anyone noticing. All right, he said. He hadn't understood yet what he'd agreed to. That understanding was still coming. Through shaft walls in the dark, with the sound of pressure doors cycling somewhere behind him and a 6-year-old girl somewhere ahead. The shafts ran hotter than the schematics said they should. Elias had noticed it the moment he dropped in, a pressure variance of roughly 4 degrees above standard, climbing. He'd already adjusted the network remotely from the resonance pad before the alarms had even finished cycling, a bleeding heat from the primary corridor and spiking it in the eastern branch where the faction's entry signatures had last registered. Not enough to injure, enough to slow, enough to make men in tactical gear start second-guessing their route. He knew these tunnels the way he knew every system he'd ever inherited, not from blueprints, but from the hours spent reading their complaints. The low hum at Junction 7 that meant the secondary valve was overdue for recalibration. The condensation pattern on the western elbow that only appeared when the ambient pressure above it dropped. He hadn't designed these shafts, but he'd spent 6 weeks learning where they ached. He moved fast and low, pad tucked against his ribs, jacket abandoned somewhere above him on the throne room floor. At Junction 4, he heard her. Not words, a sound. Small, controlled, the specific quality of a child who has been told to stay quiet and is managing it through sheer stubbornness. He followed it left, ducked under a thermal coupling, and found Alara pressed into the alcove behind a secondary access panel, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide and furious in the low amber emergency lighting. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're not supposed to be in here," she whispered. The same tone she used when correcting his thermal equations. Authoritative, slightly offended on behalf of protocol. "Neither are you," he said. He scooped her up without further discussion. She grabbed his collar with both hands and they moved. He took the route nobody had on file, the one he'd found during a routine inspection in week 2, muttering to himself about inefficient pressure routing. It added 90 seconds and bypassed every choke point on the eastern grid. Behind them, muffled and growing quieter, the faction's thermal signatures redistributed toward the wrong junction entirely. The bunker door recognized his temporary clearance. It opened. He set Alara down inside. She immediately checked his hands for injuries with the focused clinical attention of someone who had recently discovered that engineers bled the same color as everyone else. He let her, and then, in the corridor outside the bunker, the alarms cut to silence. The Empress was already there when the all-clear came. Standing at the threshold, the kind of stillness around her that wasn't calm so much as controlled. Her eyes found Alara first, then Elias. Something in her jaw released, just slightly the way a pressure seal releases when the differential finally equalizes. She didn't say anything immediately. She crossed to her daughter, crouched, checked her face with both hands, and then straightened. She looked at him for a long moment. "Your temporary clearance," she said, "is no longer accurate." 6 months later, the jacket fit. Not the rented one, that was gone, returned to whatever orbital outfitter had never expected it back in this condition. This one had been measured twice and made once, and it sat across his shoulders the way a thing sits when it belongs there. He'd stood in front of the palace tailor for 40 minutes, feeling like a fraud, and then he'd stopped, because Alara had walked in, announced she'd selected the fabric herself. Thermal-resistant weave, she'd informed him, practically. and he hadn't been able to argue with the logic. The annual summit hummed around them. The same ambassadors, the same polished floor, the same performance of cordiality. Elias sat at the royal table. Under the table, Kalia's hand found his without looking, the way someone reaches for a thing they've stopped being surprised to find there. Beside him, Alara had produced a small data pad from somewhere in her ceremonial formalware and was running thermal pressure equations with the quiet concentration of a person who found this more interesting than watching ambassadors perform at each other. He recognized that impulse. He recognized all of it, actually. The weight of the jacket across his shoulders, the small mathematician at his elbow, the hand that held his under the table like a fact that had already been decided. He didn't reach for his resonance pad. For the first time in longer than he could calculate, there was nowhere else he was supposed to be.